Opening the center establishes immediate control and hints at rapid queenside expansion. Instantly establishing central presence. Black mirrors white's ambition, setting the stage for a classic queen's-pawn battle where control of the d-file will be fiercely contested. Challenging the center immediately. This establishes dynamic play and prepares queenside expansion, forcing black to react decisively to the growing pawn storm. Solidifying the center pawn and preparing for queenside development. This setup hints at a flexible pawn structure aiming for robust defense. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for a solid, central pawn structure. Developing a knight to a central square solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for further piece activity in this Slav defense opening. Solidifying central control. This knight now supports the queenside pawns and prepares for potential development of the bishop. Embracing the pawn capture here concedes central control, potentially opening lines for white's pieces while delaying queenside development. Seizing flank initiative. This move pressures the dangling pawn and prepares queenside expansion, potentially forcing a structural concession. Developing the bishop outside the pawn chain immediately pressures white's central control and aims for active piece play. Forting the e5 square with the knight immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and offers white attacking chances against the isolated queen's pawn. Solidifying central influence. This move prepares to challenge white's ambitious knight on e5 and untangles the bishop on c8. Aiming for improved piece activity. Fortifying the center and preparing for a kingside pawn storm. This ambitious thrust ventures into territory black has carefully cultivated, potentially opening lines for an aggressive kingside assault at the cost of some positional flexibility. Sensing the bishop's precarious placement, black redirects pressure, pinning the knight and forcing white to address the immediate threat on the queenside, potentially disrupting white's intended pawn expansion and creating dynamic counterplay. Developing the bishop to this active square pins the knight, indirectly creating threats against black's central pawn structure and potentially restricting the queen's mobility. Challenging the bishop's established outpost. Black initiates a strategic pawn probe to potentially dislodge an influential piece and gain breathing room for development. Retreating the bishop preserves its active diagonal and avoids immediate pawn weaknesses around the king, though it concedes some central influence for the moment. Challenging the queenside pawn structure. Black boldly pushes c5. Aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially seize central space. This aggressive advance gambles on creating dynamic counterplay, but it also risks leaving weaknesses in its wake, particularly on the d5 square. Liberating the d-pawn opens a diagonal for the bishop and pressures black's pawn structure, potentially leading to isolated pawns or creating weaknesses. Black seizes the initiative by forcing a queen exchange, aiming to simplify into a potentially more manageable structure and avoid the immediate complications of white's central pawn push, while also freeing up the dark-squared bishop to participate more actively in the game. The royal decision to seize the pawn injects immediate complexity, forcing a reckoning with the exposed monarch and the newly opened diagonal for the remaining pieces. Solidifying the center and preparing for development. The knight aims to find a more active square, potentially on c5 or e5, depending on white's response, while simultaneously safeguarding the d5 pawn and offering a degree of control over the crucial e5 and c5 squares. This exchange liberates the knight from its defensive duties, clearing the way for a more active role in the center. And importantly, it forces black to reconsider the pawn structure on the queenside now that a major piece has been traded. Embracing the long castling, Black immediately establishes a precarious but dynamic equilibrium, sacrificing queenside space for attacking potential against the exposed white king. This aggressive stance signals a willingness to enter sharp, tactical skirmishes where piece coordination and timely pawn pushes will be paramount. Unleashing the central pawns, White aims to shatter Black's queenside pawn structure and seize a foothold in the middle of the board, forcing a positional re-evaluation of Black's exposed monarch. Sacrificing the piece initiates a cascade of forcing sequences, aiming to disrupt White's queenside structure and potentially open lines for counterplay against the exposed monarch. Relocating the monarch to a more secure outpost on c2 offers the king crucial breathing room, stepping away from the immediate threats and potential enfilades down the d-file, while simultaneously preparing to contest the now open c-file for potential future exploitation. A strategically placed bishop, the dark squared one, now shifts its focus, seeking to disrupt White's king safety and gain influence on the queenside. Seizing the opportunity, White eliminates the bishop, opening lines and aiming to exploit the exposed Black king while simultaneously developing pressure on the c-file. Reclaiming the bishop offers Black immediate compensation for the structural concessions made earlier, aiming to activate their pieces and create counterplay on the queenside. Injecting a pawn deep into Black's territory, White aims to restrict the bishop's scope and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside. A proactive approach to gaining space and initiating a gradual squeeze. Pushing the pawn forward aggressively now unleashes a storm of complications, significantly altering the pawn structure and potentially exposing your king. This dynamic pawn thrust, while aiming to gain space and possibly dislodge the bishop, creates immediate structural weaknesses around your own monarch and opens up lines for White's pieces to penetrate. Consider the long-term consequences of such a bold pawn advance. Are the immediate tactical gains worth the positional concessions and potential king safety issues that will inevitably arise? The focus shifts dramatically from quiet piece maneuvering to a sharp, tactical battle where precision will be paramount. Gaining space on the queenside with the pawn push is a gamble, potentially opening lines for Black's pieces while seeking to tie down the opponent's queenside. Expansion. Seeking to activate the rook and challenge White's queenside space advantage, Black repositions their rook from the d-file to the open d-file, aiming to create potential counterplay and prepare for the inevitable pawn storm on the kingside. The king's journey to the queenside, while seemingly defensive, cleverly aims to centralize your monarch and potentially exploit the open b-file for pawn advances or knight repositioning, a subtle shift towards a more dynamic middle game structure. Unleashing the knight towards the enemy king's vicinity. This maneuver aims to destabilize the white queenside and potentially create outposts for Black's forces. Navigating the cramped queenside, the knight sprints to the rim, aiming to secure the vulnerable outpost and disrupt Black's burgeoning kingside attack. Capturing the bishop on g3 immediately introduces an element of chaos, potentially disrupting White's pawn structure and creating tactical opportunities that weren't present before. This aggressive pawn capture, while seemingly simple, opens up lines and might lead to an unexpected exchange of material that favors Black's initiative. Consider the long-term implications for king safety if White is forced to defend awkwardly. Opening the h-file for White's rook. This pawn capture aims to exploit the awkward placement of Black's knight on g3, simultaneously creating potential for future kingside pressure and indirectly supporting the advanced a-pawn's advance. Shifting the bishop to f8 opens a diagonal for the queen to potentially re-enter the fray. But more importantly, it shores up the kingside, Notice how the pawns on the kingside, particularly the g-pawn, have advanced significantly, creating a potential weakness that the opponent's knight now eyes from its perch. This repositioning also prepares for potential pawn pushes like g5, aiming to gain more space and restrict white's pieces. Consider the trade-off. While the bishop is less active on f8 compared to its previous post, it now defends against any immediate kingside threats and allows for future defensive maneuvers. The coordination of the remaining pieces, especially the rook on d8, will be crucial in the coming exchanges, as white looks to exploit the slightly uncoordinated nature of black's army and potential kingside pawn structure vulnerabilities. Securing the half-open c-file with the rook establishes crucial control, simultaneously preparing for potential pressure against black's isolated pawn on c5 and offering a defensive pivot should the king need repositioning later. Squeezing out space on the queenside with the pawn advance has created a potentially precarious situation for black's king, now exposed on b8 without the usual pawn shield. Pushing the pawn to a6 aims to restrict black's bishop and pawn structure on the queenside, potentially creating lasting weaknesses if black isn't careful. Aggressively seizing the open file, black places their rook squarely on the c-file, directly challenging white's a-pawn and threatening to infiltrate the queenside, setting up potential tactical skirmishes with the bishop pair. The knight's journey to c3 now aims to invigorate the kingside and challenge black's central pawn chain, offering a potential outlet for white's piece pressure by eyeing f5. The rook's redeployment to the 6th rank offers a crucial defensive shield for the king while simultaneously preparing to challenge white's imposing queenside pawn chain, aiming to pry open lines for its own pieces. The rook's deployment here aims to contest the open file, an immediate priority given the pawn structure's asymmetry in the exposed black king. A daring raid on the queenside, seeking to exploit the exposed king and create immediate complications. However, it might leave the rook vulnerable to a swift counterattack. Shifting the monarch away from the open diagonal offers crucial safety, preparing for the inevitable pawn advances that will sculpt the next phase of the game while maintaining the pressure on black's queenless structure. Opening up the b-file offers a double-edged sword, creating immediate attacking potential against white's king but also potentially leaving black's own monarch exposed as the game transitions towards an endgame. White seizes the initiative, claiming the crucial open file for their rook, a direct attempt to disrupt black's king safety and create pressure along the 6th rank. Targeting the unprotected rook on c6 with the queen's gambit pawn structure now opens up an immediate threat of discovery and potential disruption of black's pawn structure. Initiating a rook transfer to the central file, this maneuver aims to both pressure black's queenside pawn majority and prepare for potential exchanges, simplifying the position towards a more favorable endgame scenario for white. Harnessing the bishop's newfound diagonal access, this placement aims to undermine white's entrenched pawn structure and begin a subtle positional unraveling, hinting at a future queenside expansion. Securing the b-pawn's advance and potentially trapping black's bishop highlights the importance of this pawn push. Opening up the c-file for your rook provides significant counterplay, threatening to infiltrate white's position and potentially disrupt their pawn structure, especially with the isolated a-pawn now a target. Pushing the g-pawn here creates significant weaknesses in white's kingside structure, potentially opening lines for black's pieces once the pawn advances. The pawn chain is now disrupted, and the kingside dark squares become a target. Opening up the kingside pawn structure like this offers a dynamic counterplay opportunity. aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed king and create attacking chances in the center and on the queenside where your pieces are more concentrated, although it does leave your own king a bit more vulnerable in the short term. Unleashing a pawn storm to rip open the kingside. This capture forces a critical decision on black concerning the fate of his central pawns. Unleashing the pawn chain's potential. Black bravely sacrifices material to shatter white's pawn structure and pry open critical lines for their pieces, unleashing the bishop to its full diagonal potential. This placement aims to exploit the currently uncastled king and pressure black's queenside pawns. Unleashing the pawn breaks open lines for your pieces, creating dynamic possibilities that exploit the exposed white king and the awkwardly placed pieces on the kingside. Initiating a bold pawn thrust to seize open space. White immediately confronts black's central pawn chain and aims to disrupt its cohesion. This aggressive advance forces black into a defensive posture, potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces and creating tactical opportunities as black scrambles to consolidate. The pressure on the e-pawn is palpable, and how black responds will dictate the subsequent skirmishes in this dynamic struggle for central dominance. The rook on d7 now enjoys vital diagonal support from its bishop on e5, creating a potent attacking battery aimed directly at white's vulnerable king. Suddenly, the kingside pawns have become a liability. White's rook insertion on the back rank rips open lines for immediate pressure. Embracing the chaos of the open files, black redirects the rook, aiming to disrupt white's perceived advantage and prepare for a potential counterattack, while simultaneously shoring up its own defensive weaknesses. Trading off the rook on the 8th rank immediately simplifies the position and forces a capture, opening the critical c-file for potential pressure. The black monarch, having escaped its vulnerable castled position, now finds itself in the heart of the action, a risky but necessary dance to avoid immediate threats. Shifting the bishop to the outpost on d5 creates immediate pressure along the central files and eyes the weakened dark squares around black's king, hinting at a potential infiltration to c6. Navigating the board towards safety, the king seeks refuge from the open files and potential sacrifices, prioritizing a more secure central position to weather the upcoming endgame storm. Sharpening the attack's edge. This rook maneuvers to the open file, preparing to pin the enemy king and disrupt black's rook coordination on the 7th rank. Recognizing the precariousness of the white king, black seeks to reinforce the bishop's presence on d6. A critical defensive outpost that actively discourages any immediate royal advances and prepares for potential counterplay once the passed pawn is dealt with. Reasserting central influence and eyeing potential outposts. The knight repositions to a square where it can participate in both defensive and offensive operations, preparing to join the fight for control of the central dark squares and potentially support a pawn advance. A vital square is reinforced, preparing to contest the open file. Pushing the b-pawn opens a fresh avenue for white's queen and creates a persistent weakness on the queenside, potentially becoming a target for black's pieces as the game simplifies. The bishop's repositioning to g6 subtly aims to contest the potentially dominant white bishop on d5. A quiet maneuver that could soon explode into a tactical skirmish if the queenside pawns advance further. Reactivating the knight to c1 allows white to potentially reroute it to a more active square. Perhaps f2 to defend the kingside or even e2 to support a central pawn push, while also freeing up the d-file for the rook. Shifting the rook's gaze to the queenside pawn chain now, aiming to fortify its presence and potentially support a future queenside advance if the Opportunity arises. Aims to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially eyeing squares like c5 or d4, while simultaneously defending the vulnerable b3 pawn and preparing to advance the b-pawn further. Aiming to disrupt black's compact pawn structure and create space. The bishop retreats, a temporary tactical concession, to a square that might become a crucial defensive anchor or a springboard for future action once the dust settles and the immediate pawn storm subsides. Unleashing the knight to c7 cramps black's rook and opens potential avenues for attack on that flank. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's centralized pieces and force them into awkward defensive positions. Initiating a rook swing to the queenside aims to dislodge black's bishop and potentially establish an outpost for the white rook. Bolstering the rook's presence on the 7th rank becomes paramount, threatening to disrupt white's entire setup. The bishop retreats, recalibrating its defensive posture and creating a crucial escape square for the rook on c4, thereby avoiding immediate material loss to the advancing black pawn. Shifting the bishop to this square aims to control the crucial diagonal leading towards white's queenside pawns and potentially support a knight repositioning, unleashing a potent threat down the critical file. This rook's deployment seeks to disrupt black's defensive structure and pry open avenues for further penetration. Forcing a piece trade here simplifies the position and eases black's defensive burden, especially with the initiative shifting away from white's isolated king. The knight lands, poised to initiate a series of exchanges that could simplify the position and lead to a clearer endgame picture for white. Reasserting pressure on the queenside. This piece repositions to threaten an immediate queenside pawn advance, aiming to disrupt white's potentially consolidated structure and open lines for further activity. The e5 thrust boldly confronts the central pawn chain, aiming to pry open lines and activate white's beleaguered queen's bishop and potentially support a breakthrough on the kingside or further central destabilization. The rook's positioning on the 7th rank presents a tantalizing, yet potentially hazardous, opportunity for the black king. King repositioning to a more active square. Eye on the b-pawn's potential weaknesses while maintaining a degree of safety from the enemy. Bishop's diagonal penetration. Unveiling a new dimension of activity. This maneuver aims to reposition the king to a more active square, preparing to potentially support an advance of the passed pawn on the kingside or to engage in the central skirmishes that are about to unfold. The king ventures out, seeking new horizons on the queenside where threats might be less concentrated. The black king ventures to the heart of the battlefield, initiating a daring maneuver to connect the rooks and potentially stir up some counterplay. King's safety finally becomes a paramount concern as the monarch ventures out, seeking a more active role and potential shelter on the queenside. Seeking to disrupt white's reinforced kingside structure. Black's bishop ventures to the rim, aiming to provoke weaknesses and potentially exchange itself for the dangerous knight which has become so active. Initiating a decisive discovered attack. The knight's leap forces the black king to a more exposed square, aiming to disrupt the coordination of the remaining pieces and potentially lead to a material advantage. Sacrificing material here opens up decisive attacking chances for white, leveraging the exposed black king. The king boldly strides into the center, a risky but potentially decisive maneuver to exploit the disorganized state of black's pieces and secure a more active position. Unveiling the passed pawn's destiny. This advance aims to create a powerful blockade breaker, but be wary of the adjacent king that now feels the chill from the knight's sudden proximity. Unleashing the monarch to claim central territory offers a potent threat to the exposed black bishop and aims to cut off escape routes for the remaining pawns. The black king, exposed and vulnerable after white's determined advance, is now directly confronted, forcing a reaction that sacrifices material to escape immediate disaster. The king's exposed position after the exchange sacrifice is now being relentlessly exploited, leaving white's monarch adrift in the center with no safe haven. The bishop's capture, while seemingly straightforward, solidifies white's knight's outpost on a prime central square, a positional advantage that could prove decisive in the ensuing race towards promotion. The white king, now an active participant, steps into the central arena, challenging the remaining black pawns and eyeing potential mating nets. The pawn's advance now secures a crucial foothold, pushing the initiative and potentially creating an unstoppable passed pawn down the queenside. Knight repositions to seize control of the vital central squares, preparing to infiltrate the weakened black kingside pawn structure and exploit the advanced a-pawn. The advanced pawn threatens to become a real menace, pushing white's king into a precarious corner where it can't easily escape a check or provide support. The knight repositions, eyeing the pawn on a3 as a potential target and preparing to support a future advance of the king. This pawn thrust, while seemingly advancing the a-pawn, creates a critical weakness on the kingside. By pushing it so far without adequate support, you leave your king remarkably exposed to the advancing white pieces, particularly that knight which is poised to leap into a devastating attack. Think about the potential discovered attacks and how your king's shelter has just evaporated.